much to learn from today's conference. Yes, and I hope you are going to talk to some of them, graduate students during the day. And I'm very honored to chair today's first session on Global G20 governance. And since we have just 1 hour for 3 distinguishing speakers, so in order to secure as much time for discussion as possible, I'd like to appreciate you giving your presentation for about 11 or maximum 12 minutes. So the first speaker, my colleague, Osaka University, Jonathan Laplace, he's talking about G20 governance from 2008 to 2019.
Good morning again. So, I have this presentation prepared. I was thinking to sit at the desk over there, but my computer is in my bag and the presentation is here, so if that's okay, I'll stand here and give the presentation. So, I'm just going to give a broad overview of the G20, basically since 2008. The G20, of course, actually began in 1999 as a finance ministerial meeting in response to the Asian financial crisis, but I'm really going to focus on the leader level G20, which for me, I think most people would agree, became really important after 2008 with the financial crisis. This was the moment when the G20 became very crucial for the world and in terms of managing the world economy, or at least contributing to that management. So the question is, how important is the G20 today? Has it continued to be important, or has it lost some significant dimensions? Well, we're going to talk about that throughout the day, of course. And as I said, I'm just going to give a broad overview then, basically of the past decade or so. So, the big kind of success for the G20 in many ways was its response to the global financial crisis. The crisis really was the impetus for creating this leader-level forum. Basically, before the 2008 crisis, in the 1990s, for example, the G8, as it was then, had attempted to kind of manage the Asian financial crisis in some ways, but without too much success, arguably. And I think that by the early 2000s, it was clear that some of the leading developing states were becoming more significant for the global economy, countries like China most obviously, but also India and others. So it was decided then, George W. Bush initially convened the summit in Washington, D.C. in November 2008 in response to the collapse of Lehman Brothers investment bank, which kind of was the spark for the global crisis beginning around September 2008. So my core arguments about the G20 as a leader forum is that it actually, I argue, it contributes to a decentralizing of global economic governance in the sense of spreading the influence to these leading developing states, even to non-state actors in some senses. The G20 governance networks contribute to contesting the norms of global governance, global economic governance, and that the G20 remains important even today when some people have doubts about its significance as at the very least a kind of crisis committee in waiting. If there is another global financial crisis, I think in 2008 there was some debate about who would manage, what forum would manage the crisis response. I think now the most obvious forum, again, would be the G20. So the significance of the G20, of course, it accounts for around 2/3 of the world population, well, I would say probably around 85% more or less of the world economy, 80% of world trade, indeed a significant amount, 80% of world carbon emissions. So it's really very significant for the world. It's not just 20 members out of nearly 200 UN members, but it's actually, well, of course, it's 19 states plus the European Union, in fact. But the weight of those countries, those members, is extremely significant. So, in the literature on the G20, certainly there are various perspectives as you would expect. These are just plugging a couple of my books here that I've written in recent years. So my research then has been very much about the G20 and more broadly global economic governance. So I would say that the G20 then was certainly important in 2008, 2009, very successful. And I think without G20 cooperation, for example, at their London summit in April 2009, basically they put together a kind of rescue package, a stimulus package for the global economy that arguably was the thing that stopped us from having even a kind of Great Depression in the past decade. So it has been extremely significant. There has been heightened uncertainty in terms of the norms of global governance since then, and more contestation, a wider variety of perspectives, arguably. And I think the G20 reflects that broader range of perspectives. You have had different kind of views about the what is happening, whether we have a kind of West versus the rest, whether we have other dynamics happening. There are big questions here. So the G20 then was it was historically extremely significant. There was a new kind of feeling that there was no consensus necessarily in terms of the norms of economic governance, but at the very least, you had the G20 as a focal point for debating these issues during and after the financial crisis. And in a sense, the forum itself recognized the significance of those large developing countries, especially the so-called BRICS. It provided opportunities also for non-G7 states to have a direct influence on global governance. So we've just seen the Argentine presidency of the G20, so in a sense Argentina, their government had the opportunity to try and influence the global governance agenda, the G20 agenda. Previously you've had countries like Mexico, indeed China obviously becoming integrated in global economic governance through the G20, and of course now Japan getting this opportunity. Now, I think it is a great opportunity for Japan, and I hope this year is a great success for the Japanese government in promoting a positive agenda for the G20. Just a very brief note, I don't want to get too much into technicalities, but I would say that there has been in a sense, we have seen this kind of period of hyper-globalization perhaps from the 1990s, early 2000s. Perhaps we have had a shift away from that, and I suggest with this kind of dotted line here that there are some more kind of measures gradually limiting aspects of global financial speculation, although some would say that some of the new regulations, the Basel III Accords perhaps in particular, maybe haven't gone far enough. We'll have to see. The big test is whether we have another crisis. But certainly we haven't reached a kind of Bretton Woods 2.0 in terms of global economic governance in the past decade, even though some people advocated that. But at the very least, there seemed to be some greater emphasis on the importance of managing the kind of global context, the macro context of global economic governance, rather than leaving everything to the market, so to speak. And we have had this kind of shift in norms of policy norms and practices. So that's what I'm illustrating with this slide here. A kind of shift from this kind of borderless world kind of logic, related to the idea of open markets, to a greater emphasis on a kind of strategic role for governments and indeed for multilateral cooperation through the G20. I would say that this was certainly the case after the during the financial crisis. The question is, what kind of normative shifts do we see now? What is happening with the rise of populism, for example, as people see it since 2016, and whether there is further contestation in terms of the norms of global economic governance. Certainly, the shift from the G7, G8 to the G20, again, that in itself, to me, indicates a kind of normative shift in terms of, let's say, the principle of involving a wider range of actors, and especially states, but also even beyond the states. The G20 has been very innovative in terms of broadening stakeholder engagement through its engagement forums, which has been very important. So this, again, I don't want to talk about this too much for time reasons, but this is this kind of normative shift we see within global economic governance, and the G20 has been very crucial there, especially in terms of in global financial governance, the shift from micro to macro-prudential financial regulation as one example, and the support for sustainable development, what I would call a new sustainable development consensus, moving beyond the old Washington consensus approach. So is the G20 a club, a hub, network? I mean, what is the G20? In some, technically, in all kinds of forums, you get these debates about the significance of the G20. What is it? I would say that in some ways, we don't need to worry too much about this. I personally agree quite a lot with Professor Curtin's hypothesis that the G20 is a kind of hub of global governance in terms of its kind of organizing role at the center, not only with states, but also with international organizations like the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank. The G20 has played a key kind of coordinating role in global governance since the global financial crisis. And of course, as I said, integrating this more wider, diverse range of states. So the agenda, I would say, has expanded. There is a strong debate about questions about legitimacy and efficiency. You should, those of you that perhaps are not experts in the G20 might have questions about the legitimacy or efficiency of the G20. It isn't a universal body like the UN, for example, and this continues, and it has been since the beginnings, certainly since the financial crisis. There's been a big debate about whether the G20 is legitimate, whether it should narrow its agenda to be more efficient in order to achieve goals in a narrow range of policy areas. As it happens, the agenda has expanded to include a wider range of issues over the years, very much influenced by the non-G7 members, beginning with South Korea in 2010 when they put development issues on the agenda. And over the years, the agenda has kind of expanded to a wider range of issues and involving a wider range of actors, including non-state stakeholders. For example, last week I myself was at the Think 20 Engagement Forum conference in Tokyo, which was much easier to reach than the summit in Buenos Aires a couple of months ago, thankfully. But Buenos Aires was very nice, but also very far from Tokyo. So that was me there in that picture speaking in Buenos Aires at the Think 20 Summit. So that's an example of this kind of outreach. There is also the Women's 20 Summit, and as was mentioned earlier, a unofficial group, but nevertheless important group, the Girls 20, and then there's a range of other of these engagement forums, bringing other elements of civil society and non-state actors into the G20 debate and proposals from those groups are then given to the G20. So, to conclude, I would say that G20's cooperation during the crisis, especially in 2008, 2009, was extremely important. And without it, in terms of boosting global confidence, I think that we really would have been looking at a kind of Greece-style scenario potentially in many countries without the G20 cooperation in that period. Post-crisis, multilateral cooperation at the G20, certainly it's been important on a range of global policy issues. And despite these challenges to multilateralism since 2016, I would say the G20 remains a source of actual and indeed also potential cooperation continuing, despite the fact that we have had this kind of decade of global turbulence. I think in that sense the G20 has been a kind of a stabilizing force, even if some people have doubts about it and questions about it, and of course that there are legitimate questions to ask. But overall, I would say that it has been positive for multilateral cooperation and indeed bringing non-state actors into the dialogue. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kast. Our second speaker is Professor Elizabeth Fonkina from Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. She's a specialist on international relations in Asia Pacific and has published extensively in both English and Russian on regional institutions such as G20 and APEC. For today's conference, Professor Fonkina talks of G20 compliance, making commitment that counts.
Thank you. Dear participant of the conference, I'm very happy to be today there, representing our joint research, long-term research with the G20 research group at the University of Toronto. We have a long stories of studying the G20, and we have very interesting results, which confirm the importance and of the G20 of the modern world. The first point of my presentation is that the group of 20 is not a talking shop, as a journalist and some experts would like to say. The G20 leaders made more 2,000 concrete commitments and their summits. From the first summit in Washington. The compliance of the G20 members with the commitments made is also very high, about 40%. The commitments cover more than 30 spheres. On this slide, you could see the spheres in which the G20 members made their commitments. The most number of commitments cover macroeconomy, financial regulation, development, and tax. In the recent years, the G20 has broadened its agenda and cover some new spheres of cooperation like digitalization and energy, climate, etc. Our methodology of our long-term project is presented at our website. It's a little bit difficult to be described there, but we assess the priority commitments. We selected the priority commitments and assess every year. The results are presented in the reports published on the eve of each G20 summits. On this slide, a short description description of the methodology is presented. How how it looks like. And now I would like to turn to the compliance of the commitments, which support the G20 importance in the global governance. 74 is an average level of commitments for all the monitoring period. The monitoring is completed since the first summit in Washington. As you may see, the level of compliance is very high. And now I would like to speak about several spheres, the key spheres. The first, financial regulation, macroeconomy, and reform of international financial institutions. As you know, the Group of 20 was established as the global forum to address the financial crisis. A number of commitments made and a level of compliance with them is very high for all periods. The second important spheres are health, employment, and development. The level of compliance in these spheres is also very high. The third example of the G20 cooperation is digitalization and trade. As we may see, the G20 members complied with the digitalization commitments very well, but not for trade, because in the recent year we see a rise of protectionism, investment, and trade. Despite the work is done in the World Trade Organization and by some G20 members, this sphere of cooperation doesn't look such good as other spheres. Now I would like to turn to the results of compliance with the Hamburg commitments. As you may see on these slides, the most G20 members complied with the commitments in finance, tax, health, energy, macroeconomics very well. Migration, trade, and corruption are among the spheres with the lowest compliance. Here comes the slide with compliance by the G20 members. I will be able to comment these results after my presentation. And the concluding point of my presentation is devoted to Japan and the forthcoming Japanese presidency. As you may see, Japan complied with the 20 commitments very well, like the average compliance rate. I think that Japan will be able to hold its presidency very successfully, and after its presidency, complying with the commitments made also very well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Sokonchina. Our next speaker is Professor David Welch, Center for International Governance Innovation, Chair of Global Security at the Wellesley School of International Affairs, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. As a specialist of international security studies, Professor Welch has written many award-winning articles and books in the field. Particularly, Professor Welch is co-author of Understanding Global Conflict and Cooperation, one of the standard textbooks in the field. And he also co-editor of Japan as a noble country, a nation in search of its place in the world. And today, Professor Welch is talking of G20 in the Asian context.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's the first time to visit Osaka, so I'm very pleased to be here. I was once at a conference on ethics and international affairs at the University of British Columbia, and one of the participants was Charles Darwin's great-grandson, who is a very prominent British historian. He was very nervous about speaking at this conference on ethics and international affairs with so many political theorists and political scientists. So a friend of his said, well, don't worry, if someone challenges you, just say that ethics is not your period. I feel like I'm in a similar situation here because I claim no G20 expertise. That is not where I earn my bread and butter. I pay close attention to Asia-Pacific security, but I am no expert, as I said, in G20 matters whatsoever. In fact, I learned two interesting facts from the previous presentation. One is that the Toronto Summit had the fewest number of commitments and the second lowest level of compliance. So as a Canadian, of course, I take great shame in that. And the other thing I learned is that G20 has made zero commitments on security issues, which is not an enormous surprise, but I hadn't quite realized that was an entire area of neglect. So what I would like to do is think a little bit about what role, if any, the G20 could play, particularly on Asia-Pacific security, and secondly, what might the Osaka Summit specifically accomplish on security matters. By way of background, I would note, and this is not news to anyone, that we live in a very peculiar time. We live in a time where almost all of the important countries in the world are engaged in inward-looking politics. Domestic political agenda is overwhelming. We're living through a time of polarization and increasing extremism. We're living through the erosion of embedded liberalism, the grand compromise at the end of the Second World War, by which states stake their claim to provide for the welfare of their own people in return for a relatively open, liberal international trading order. And we are experiencing a global leadership vacuum. At the moment, the most powerful countries in the world are led by people that are either unwilling or unable to actually play a global leadership role. There's these two interesting exceptions to that. One is the Chancellor of Germany, and the other, I would argue, is Japan's Prime Minister. Japan and Germany being two current beacons of stability and continuity with the previous liberal international order. Complicating this is the fact that the Asia-Pacific is home to 4 potentially explosive flashpoints. The Korean Peninsula, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and the Strait of Taiwan. These are potentially catastrophic because in all 4 cases, there's at least one country on either side of the dispute that is armed with nuclear weapons. And in several of the cases, the countries on opposite sides of the dispute are the United States and China. So the G20 also has, it's not known for its security role, and it's not a big surprise that it doesn't have one, in part because it lacks the unity of purpose to act with one voice to take a leadership role on security issues for several reasons. One is that the United States, the so-called indispensable power, is in fact at the moment very skeptical of global governance. Second, of course, is the US-China geopolitical struggle, ongoing and intensifying. The third is Sino-Indian rivalry. China and India, of course, very important members of the G20. And the fourth, and not the last, is a very complicated Russia-US relationship at the moment. At the popular level, it's very tense. At the political elite level, it's very intense. But at the leader-to-leader level, it's actually surprisingly positive. So that's a historically unprecedented situation. Final point is that the Asia-Pacific is actually a region that's extremely densely governed in terms of security issues. It's got a proverbial alphabet soup of security organs, which ASEAN is the center, the hub. They're famously ineffective, I would argue, for the most part, but it does raise the question, what would the value added be for the G20 to play a security role? It's not clear what its added value would be. Now, what's the good news? I'm very depressing up to this point. What's the good news? First piece of good news is that everyone in the region has a very strong interest in avoiding crises, if possible. No one has a strong interest in a major conflict in the Pacific. Of course, the costs of regional conflict would be horrendous, and everybody does understand this. Another piece of good news is that the main drivers of conflict in two of the flashpoints I mentioned are, in fact, misperceptions and misjudgments. In other words, protagonists wrongly believe that there are zero-sum stakes engaged because they fundamentally misunderstand the interests, wants, needs, fears of the other. One of these is the East China Sea, and that was not a major flashpoint until 2012, when the Japanese government nationalized the islands, purchasing them from the private owner, precisely to avoid a conflict with China, because Governor Ishihara had offered to buy them, and it was clear that he was going to build structures on them and put people there if he actually had ownership. So it was to prevent that potential conflict with China that Tokyo purchased the islands. The Chinese did not understand this at the time, and it took 2 years for the government finally to come around to the view that Tokyo had tried to avoid a conflict with China by purchasing the islands instead of tried to provoke a conflict with China. Now that particular issue is beginning to settle down. Last year, for the first time since 2012, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces has reduced the number of scrambles it has had to make against intruding Chinese aircraft around the Senkaku Islands, and the maritime interceptions continue, but not at a heightened level. So that seems to be an issue that's beginning to subside, and the blockade will come down, go back to its pre-2012 status quo. South China Sea is the other area where conflict is really being driven by misperceptions and misunderstandings. Extremely good piece of news in the South China Sea was the 2016 Philippines Arbitration Tribunal decision that clarified a number of very important ambiguities in interpreting the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as it applies to the South China Sea. What people have generally not noticed is that China has been fully complying with the Philippines arbitration decision since 2016. They have not advertised this. They have publicly rejected the decision as not having jurisdiction. But if you look carefully at what China has been doing in the South China Sea for the last 2 years, you will notice that they have done nothing that is technically inconsistent with the Philippines arbitration decision. And in fact, China has been attempting to cultivate cooperative opportunities for resource management and maritime safety with other claimants in the region. So the South China Sea is actually, at the moment, a good news story. And nobody understands this because they're still focused on the fact that China built some enormous artificial islands and put runways and so on actions that China took 5 to 7 years ago, planned 5 to 7 years ago, had paid for and are simply completing the blueprints of. And by the way, the main purpose of building those artificial islands was to enforce an air defense identification zone that China has subsequently decided it doesn't want in the South China Sea. So those artificial islands are in fact enormous white elephants. So China is in fact complying. The bad news. The other two flashpoints are not grounded in misperceptions and misjudgments. North Korea is clearly keen on retaining and enhancing its strategic nuclear capability. They are doing absolutely nothing meaningful by way of denuclearization and have shown no sign whatsoever of any intention to denuclearize meaningfully. In addition, it's possible, and this is uncertain, but it's possible that Kim Jong-un is dangerously ambitious. We know very little about him, but there are certain indications that he suffers from the kinds of pathologies that long-term absolute rulers are prone to, such as a sense of invulnerability, a sense of infallibility, belief in the superiority of his own judgment and skill. And it's quite possible that Kim Jong-un has on his long-term to-do list the reunification of Korea under Pyongyang's rule. That is an extremely serious long-term problem. And Taiwan, probably the biggest long-term problem in the region. Key question here is whether Beijing will lose interest first or lose patience first in bringing Taiwan back into the fold, because it's very clear that Taiwan will not voluntarily return to the mainland. The demographics make that clear. Young Taiwanese have no interest and don't identify increasingly with the mainland. So what could the G20 do at Osaka on security issues? If I were being asked my advice, which never happens, I would say G20 should address security issues, but focus on the positives. In other words, the messaging on security issues should stress the importance of avoiding crisis, the costs of disruption in peace and stability. In addition, the G20 should continue to stress the importance of the rule of law and international stability. And by the way, it's my view that G20 members do tend to agree generally on the importance of the rule of law. That is not necessarily an important internal cleavage. And the third thing I think the G20 could do is encourage more active empathy-building processes to try to help key players understand better the interests, wants, needs, fears, beliefs, and perceptions of the other side. And with luck, that those processes would reduce the tensions in at least two of those core flashpoints. What could Japan in particular do at the Osaka summit? I would like to see Japan, frankly, take up the mantle of the regional governance champion. As I said, there are two responsible leaders in the world right now among the great powers. One is Angela Merkel of Germany, and one is Prime Minister Abe of Japan. I would like to see Prime Minister Abe embrace the role of regional governance champion. I would also like to see Japan leverage the CPTPP success to protect and promote the open trade regime. That's a foundation on which the region and the world could build profitably, given that the WTO is no longer the site of action in promoting and defending open international trade. And the third thing I would like to see Japan do at the summit is offer to host dialogues on enhancing the G20's security role. Begin the conversation about whether the G20 can or should begin to make commitments on security issues, commitments that they can, in fact, comply with. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Welch. Professor Hurst gave us an excellent summary for the recent evolution of G20, especially in the last decade. Professor Honkina proposes a very detailed analytic methodology to compare the degree of compliance among G20 members. And Professor Welch, thank you very much for providing the security flashpoints in which G20 is located. And he also talks of the potential Japanese role or leadership in coming G20 Osaka summit. Okay, so now I'd like to receive some questions from the floor. When you raise your question, please identify yourself and please identify which speaker you are asking the question. Let me start with Professor Kawano.
Thank you very much. The evidence in many ways tells me that G20 summits are on the rise as an effect of a global governance institution, and that is, I think, a lonely position in the great G20 debate. One of the ways in which I think you can see the emerging efforts and effectiveness is the G20 is the G20 is a global security governor in ways I think that David and I would share a definition of what security is. From close to the beginning, of course, it all of a sudden turned to terrorism, a non-state security threat, but nonetheless, after the 9/11 moment, a very big deal in the world, and has stayed with it, including at the leaders level. I put crime and corruption in the security category. Yes, it has economic and developmental effects, but I think for peace, order, and good government, it's quite critical. And then we can look more deeply at President Xi's motives in purging corruption and the political implications of there. What's been more interesting of late is it's focused on, I guess, the biggest issues, weapons of mass destruction. And here, St. Petersburg, 2013, the dinner devoted entirely to ending the routine use of a weapon of mass destruction in Syria with chemical weapons, and an effective conclusion. Assad got rid of them because of, I argue, that G20 moment until such time as Barack Obama left the presidency of the United States and the problem resumed. At Hamburg, I think another very effective summit. There was a session devoted, free leaders session, which did have an intense discussion of the North Korean nuclear threat, where the major speakers were the leaders of Japan, South Korea, the United States. All of that to say, David, that I think you are going with the flow, all right? The conversation has started, but perhaps not in the kind of peace-building way in which the serious scholars of the subject, such as yourself, think of it. The one question I would have, and it does end with a question, it flows from the fact that another measure of the G20's growth as global security government is the emergence of a G20 foreign ministers forum, and that is, of course, foreign ministers tend to do a lot of things, but they do security as well. Interestingly, Japan has put its foreign ministerial meeting at the very end of its year. We have to wait another year before it happens. Would it be useful to have G20 foreign ministers, or one could think of components of it, a working group, a structure, start to work right here, right now? And another, I guess, suggestion I'm thinking of is the Argentinians started by thinking of it from the beginning as a regional summit, and started working at the Sherpa level with their colleagues in Brazil and Mexico. That didn't, stay the course. There were political transitions. But would you advise the government of Japan to reach out from the beginning in the Sherpa process to form not just the usual troika guidance pole, but an Asian regional one, or a Northeast Asian regional one, as a way of incubating? If you get those three together, I think the security subjects you speak about, the North Korean one, will naturally come up.
Okay, so Carlton, who is to respond to your question? Okay, so yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. So as I said, ethics is not my period, but there's some definitional disagreement, I think, behind what you said. I wouldn't personally call transnational crime a security issue. That's not the kind of thing I and my good friends do. Terrorism is like the world's most overrated security issue. With John Mueller on this one, as a cause of premature death, terrorism ranks way down the list, far below bathtub accidents and McDonald's. I was interested to hear your remarks about the discussions about weapons of mass destruction and non-proliferation. I know that the previous speaker slide that there were no commitments on non-proliferation, so I gather there weren't any commitments. And I don't recall any commitments about gas is Syria even
No, these are private
a conversation? Yeah, so that's terrific. I would really encourage that. I would like to see those discussions lead to some interesting developments down the road, but I think the foreign ministers meeting is a great idea. Very seldom do bad things happen when we get foreign ministers together. Just let them interact in a relatively informal way. So yeah, I do hope that continues.
Yeah, before answering, probably we should take all the questions, 3 questions, yeah.
Okay, shall I start with another question? Actually, one for all of you. Jonathan, if I can start with you, it is really positive to hear your thoughts that the G20 actually does offer, or it plays a very valid, relevant role in global economic governance. One of the things I'm interested in is that the G20 itself has to have some kind of attraction for leaders to want to be part of it at a time when they are thinking much more about their own internal situations. Am I right in thinking that Giappone didn't go to Buenos Aires? He was there? I have a feeling. I have a feeling he wasn't, and it just struck me because we had Marty Nangawa at our institute at the time talking about this issue of leadership. We've got so many leaders, a huge deficit in actual leadership. So my question to you is, what can the G20 do to make sure leaders still turn up at least once a year to engage in that process? Because it seems like there's real risk that some are withdrawing from it. Elisabetta, my question for you, it's so interesting to see all these commitments. And I guess I would almost challenge the idea that the G20 is not a talk shop. When you see thousands of commitments, my question is, how do we know how meaningful the impact of those commitments, of meeting those commitments or compliance to those commitments actually is over time? How does that reporting happen? And then, David, my question, it's really fascinating to hear that, to see these perspectives between economic governance and security issues. And from an in Australia, we're now talking about the Indo-Pacific. We're seeing the emergence of multiple alignments and alliances, but more so alignments with like-mindeds and non-like-mindeds, and the emergence of multiple fault lines. So the geometry of the place has really shifted. The G20, if nothing else, offers quite a useful, and I think you've already mentioned this anyway, but it offers a very useful opportunity for leaders just to get together. One of the issues that seems to be creeping into the security space more and more, at least from an Australian perspective, is the influence of China through the Belt and Road Initiative, the kind of debt traps that is leading to the region, and how strategic influence is being projected through various assets around the place. It strikes me that Japan may well play a role in this G20 to talk about managing those kinds of economic relationships differently. I wonder if you've thought of, if that's on your radar, what you're thinking about it and where that might go.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry, should have done that at the very beginning. Caitlin Byrne, Griffith Asia Institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I expect that. Because especially for my graduate students, this is a very good opportunity to get to know these things, professors and scholars. So please, I guess, any ask questions.
Thank you. I'm Melissa Conley-Tyler from the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And again, I have comments for all. Jonathan, I just want to say, fascinating as always. For me, watching the evolution of G20 as a global governance institution, that's exciting, and your contribution to that has been great over time. I wanted to come in on that hub and club idea, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. If I look at, my example would be something like APEC. It has over time done both those things. So it's the hub in the sense of the officials and the researchers who work on the trade issues, and often it's sort of unglamorous work. It's not very exciting for the broader community, but it's the facilitation that enables all sorts of better policy making. But When you actually bring the leaders together, well, that's the club, that's the summit, and the leaders don't care about what's happening with, you know, the border, behind the border trade restrictions on this, that or the other. They talk about whatever leaders want to talk about, which is whatever's currently relevant, which leads me to David. That's where I think the security issues are discussed, and that's where I think they should be discussed. That the way you talked about, you know, building empathy, you know, the personal relationships, that's through the leaders level when they get together, when they can, as John was saying, just talk about whatever they think is currently relevant. I wouldn't build it into the hub level. I don't think there's a benefit to having G20 working groups and officials talking about security issues. I don't see that that's going to help. We've got a lot of institutions in Asia that try, and you know, given how far the East Asia Summit has gone on in this, for example, I have no confidence that G20 would get any further. Officials talk about it as the Christmas tree effect, that as they're hosting it each year, each new host, each new person puts another decoration on the Christmas tree until the poor Christmas tree can hardly hold its branches up. And that's how they see it. They really feel like everyone's trying to put more on. I think that's a general you know, inclination we have. We see an institution that is actually almost functioning in international affairs, and then we say, oh, it can deal with everything. And I think, well, no, that's just going to make it not be able to do anything. And we really want it to be successful, obviously. So my last question, and it comes close to the success side, I suppose, was for Samantha. I really thank you for the data, for you and the G20 research group. It's really useful and important that we all have that to see what is actually happening. And I was really struck by how high Japan's compliance is, which I think is very positive. So I'm looking even ahead a year. I'm interested in Saudi Arabia's compliance as the 2020 host. I'm also interested in their capacity to actually run this. And I suppose, you know, thinking ahead for Japan's presidency, how much is being built in to try to build the capacity of Saudi Arabia as next host to continue some of the things that Japan's trying to do.
Thank you very much. We have one more.
I don't know if I should wait. I don't know how much time we have left because you've got to respond to all these questions as well. My question was really about, I'm Annemette Fisker-Nilsson here from the Faculty of Letters here at Soka University, and I work on domestic Japanese politics, so I'm not an expert in international relations as such, but in recent years I've been moving into security issues as well, but particularly from the perspective that you also talked about, David Welch, that in terms of public perception and governance, and in a sense management of public perceptions and misperceptions and how it's represented in the media. So I was really struck by your talk about Abe as taking on the sort of the vacuum of leadership that's currently happening. Because of course if you're looking at politics from inside Japan and from outside Japan, you kind of get a different perspective, and I really agree that kind of Prime Minister Abe is very much seen as a kind of world leader in many different ways and taking lots of different steps on behalf of Japan that sort of indicates that. And he's looked upon differently from outside. From inside Japan, you may also know domestically, there is, particularly around security issues, and one of my points about the security issues and security legislation is that actually it wasn't a drastic step towards any change. It was a kind of catch up with the past 20 years of security legislation has been implemented by the Japanese government and so on. And, but of course we know domestic politics on the other side has in a sense kind of used, the debates become very binary and divisive and in a sense quite populist and away from actual legislation to governance. Okay, so I was just wondering, sorry, make my comments short, Prime Minister Abe as a world leader, how do you see that in relation to domestic politics? Because of course, as many of you have also indicated, domestic politics are really important in terms of actual international relations and so on, and how they respond to domestic politics. So, thank you.
Now I'm asking each speaker to reply with 3 minutes at max. Or 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. A lot of questions. I'm glad we have so many questions. It shows that the audience is very much engaged. I will be as quick as possible. So I just want to note quickly in relation to what John said before, I wonder, I mean, just a note, I think possibly the trilateral summits that seem to have begun again with South Korea, China, Japan, maybe that. I'm not sure if they're scheduled to have one in the next few months. I would need to check, but that could be a point of discussion and cooperation, even on some of the agenda issues. Moving to Caitlin, I think Caitlin and Melissa, your two questions, in a sense, there was some connection there. Specifically on the leaders showing up. On the whole, over the years, they have tended to show up. Now and again, there's been one or two no-shows, but on the whole, they have. Even this summit, the fact that Donald Trump showed up instead of sending Mike Pence, the fact that Donald Trump actually signed up to the leaders' declaration, there was all this speculation beforehand that he might not because the APEC declaration hadn't been signed off by the US. So I think the fact that even Donald Trump feels that he has to go there and even sign a declaration is a sign that the leaders take it seriously. And I do think that, I mean, if we see in future that leaders stop showing up, that would be a sign that the G20 is losing its significance. But I feel that still it does have that pull for the leaders. And in relation to that point, I think also with Melissa's point, this is the issue. Is it a cherished club, which is, as John used that phrase in his book, is it a cherished club for the G20 leaders? Does it have that intimacy of the old G7? There are, clearly it's more diverse in that sense. Does it have the kind of we-ness normatively? But then even within the G7, does it have that anymore? Again, I wrote, I think a couple of years ago, that ever since Donald Trump got there, certainly, the G7 is often as divided as the G20. So, yes, clearly there are some differences in that sense, but I do think that it remains at least a hub. Is it really a club? I think certainly they go there, whether we call it a club or not, it's a point of for dialogue. Even the bilaterals have got so much attention, in my opinion, too much attention at the Buenos Aires summit. The fact that there are those opportunities for the bilaterals itself is a value added of the G20 summits. I would like there to be more focus on the policy agenda. I wrote about that last week. And in a sense, I think that's for us as stakeholders and people engaged in G20 work, at least in terms of the engagement groups, etc. And as academics, I think we need to do more to push the actual agenda onto the agenda, so to speak, for the media, for the public. Throughout the year, this is something I was saying in our meeting last week of the task force of the T20, that there needs to be, we need to have a stronger strategy for public engagement, public diplomacy indeed, in a sense, related to Caitlin's work. And I think that is crucial now, to actually get normative pressure from below, from society, from citizens, to push G20 leaders to actually implement the pledges that they commit to. So anyway, I think that's my time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I think the main question is how to assess the G20 commitments' influence on the national governments. What I can say that the commitments made by the G20 members covered the most important spheres of cooperation spheres and of global economic governance, tax governance. For example, the decisions made in the tax spheres now are implemented not only by the G20 member countries, but other countries of the world which joined the BEPS inclusive framework. So the influence is really great. Now the G20 discuss the digitalization, the governance of digitalization. The digital economy is a new reality, and we don't have any norms and global principles in this sphere. So the G20 could make real decisions and on these norms and principles, which will in the future will be implemented in the national regulation.
Thanks. So very quickly, in reply to Caitlin, my own Belt and Road initiative is that it's actually quite a desperate move on the part of the party to keep the growth rates up, because that's what their legitimacy depends upon. And I also think it's not going to work. So it's not a grand expansionist strategic move. It's sort of a sign of desperation more than anything else. Japan is countering with the free and Indo-Pacific narrative. I think that narrative will have some traction, but I don't think the G20 is going to be a place where you're going to have any kind of resolution as between those two things. Melissa, I just tend to agree with you. I don't think we need more ornaments on these trees, but I am really encouraged to hear that the leaders are more and more interested in talking about security issues. On Japanese domestic politics, I think you nailed it exactly. The lesson from the security legislation debate is that you just want to stay away from changing things, right? So the Japanese people have embraced Japan's internationalist role, and it's quite a switch from 20 years ago. And so it's working well, and I think Japanese people like the fact that Japan is playing a more active international role. Just don't make the mistake of trying to change the Constitution. That's a fight you do not need, and you're not going to get anything positive out of it anyway. Could I just ask if there's any questions or comments from students? Right? I'd love to hear comments from students, and I know we have some here today.
Any comments from students?
Always interested to hear the perspective of students.
Maybe one of the SIP students.
They're just warming up.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Nobody.
They're not ready. Question, but okay. Thank you very much for everyone's cooperation. I'm very happy to have a very intensive first session on G20 governance. Now I'd like to propose we have a coffee break up to 10:50. 5 minutes extension. Thank you very much.